everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Penny Wright, and we're delighted to have a return visit from a speaker whom some of you know, who's been here several times already. His name is Phil Keith. And Phil is here to talk about his latest novel, titled Settling Up. He holds a degree in history from Harvard, and after his graduation, Phil went into the Navy and served in Vietnam. He was awarded the Air Medal, the Purple Heart, the Presidential Unit Citation, and the Navy Commendation Medal. After his service, Phil rose to the rank of commander in the Naval Reserve. He is also a licensed U.S. Coast Guard master's mate. As a business executive, he worked for 2 Fortune 500 firms and is a former assistant professor of business at Long Island University. Since 2007, Phil has been an adjunct instructor at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he teaches marketing and writing courses. He has written 3 novels and 7 works of nonfiction to date. His Vietnam book, titled Black Horse Riders, from St. Martin's Press, won the 2012 award from the USA Book News for Best Military Nonfiction, and it also earned a silver medal in 2013 from the Military Writers Society of America. His second Vietnam book, Firebase Illingworth, also published by St. Martin's Press, was released in 2013. Stay the Rising Sun was published in 2015, and it's an account of the crucial World War II Battle of the Coral Sea and the loss of the aircraft carrier USS Lexington in May of 1942. It won the Admiral Samuel Morrison Prize for Naval Literature and a gold medal from the Military Writers Society. Phil's next project is in partnership with Tom Clavin, whom some of you know, and it will be released by HarperCollins next year. And it sounds very exciting. It will be titled Love and Glory, and it's about Eugene Bullard, who was the first African-American fighter pilot. So next year, same time, whenever. Phil serves on the planning board for the town of Southampton, writes an award-winning column for the Southampton Press, and is a member of the VFW Post 55350, American Legion Post 924, the Disabled American Veterans, and Vietnam Veterans of America. He lives in Southampton with his partner, Laura Lyons, and is she here? Yes, right, here she is. And his son Pierce, who I don't believe is here because he's probably in school.
Correct. Let's see, he's in AP World History.
Okay. Please welcome Phil Keith.
All right, I have to strap myself in here. Yikes. Let me adjust this. I tend to talk loud, so.
Think of it as a bar stool.
Yes. Oh, now I'm comfortable. All right. We're in
Do you want a
business.
regular chair or the regular chair?
No, I think bar stool's good.
Okay.
I'm gonna have my drink.
Is that long enough for the-
I'm all set to go. Thank you, Penny, for that introduction, and thank, of course, the Rogers Library. Great, always great to be here. Our hometown library, and we, as I appreciate, we who write, appreciate all that people like Penny and the library do to support local authors. It's a great thing. Well, you're here today, I suspect, to learn a little bit about this book called Settling Up and why I wrote it. Let me just start to give you the background by reading the brief foreword. In case you haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, this will kind of put all this in context. This is obviously a Vietnam book. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it good? 2,709,009 118 warriors in American uniform served in Vietnam. The peak war years occurred between August 5th of 1964, when the war was ramped up by President Lyndon Johnson, and May 7, 1975, when the conflict was finally ended by President Gerald Ford. Over 58,156 men and women made the ultimate sacrifice. Most of those lost died in combat, 47,359. And every one of those casualties earned medals for service and sacrifice. Others, 10,797, perished in friendly fire incidents, deadly accidents, disease, sickness, and a few were murdered or committed suicide. The wounded totaled 153,303. Tremendous advances in battlefield medicine before and during the war prevented many of these casualties from becoming counted among the dead. Nonetheless, many who survived were maimed for life. Thousands who descended from the freedom birds bringing them back to the world never returned at all. There are men and women who 50 years later still remain haunted by the terrors and the nightmares, survivors' guilt and regrets. The sacred dead have resting places in hallowed ground across the land. Those who served with honor and courage have, for the most part, received their due. Conflicting sentiments regarding Vietnam have gradually morphed into belated respect for those who answered their country's call. Slowly, surely, and generally peacefully, the nation has begun to close this fractured chapter in its history. Not completely, though. There are some still alive who betrayed the cause. We had craven cowards who let others do the dying in their stead. We suffered some leaders of such poor judgment that they sacrificed their soldiers needlessly. A small coterie of sadists tortured and maimed in violation of all the rules of civilized conduct. A gaggle of schemers and manipulators gained the system for their own profit or advancement. Some in positions of trust made veterans suffer needlessly via their policies of ignorance and neglect. Too many were utterly negligent and criminally stupid and caused needless emotional and physical trauma to their countrymen and women. The souls of those who died by treachery or malice demand justice. The voices inside the heads of those still trapped in the war continue to echo down the halls of VA psych wards across America. The 1,643 who are still missing silently beg to be found. Some staring at empty sleeves, vicious scars, burn marks, or blinded and not able to stare at all, still ask, was it worth it? Who will close the books for these warriors once and for all? Who will even the score for those who can no longer do so for themselves? Who will pay the final butcher's bill, long overdue? One man has decided he must try. He has set out on a quest to settle up. Therefore, the title. The first question I always get, and please, I'm interruption driven, so at any time, feel free to ask questions. I enjoy questions. But the first question I usually get is, why did I write this book? It is a work of fiction. There are true stories between the pages, somewhere. I'll let you figure out which ones are true and which ones are fiction. I have lifted some brave deeds that I know personally from experience or from the pages of history are true and are recounted in this book, but most of the rest of it is made up. And why did I bother? Well, fiction is really not in my wheelhouse normally. I'm primarily a nonfiction writer. Of the books that I've been lucky enough to complete and get published, the vast majority of them are military history, obviously nonfiction. So why the departure? Well, because I wanted to. But Also, as I look back at my life, certainly my Vietnam experience was a seminal experience in my life, and had a great impact on me, and still does to this day. I lost friends. I made good friends, lifelong friends. But Vietnam, as I mentioned in that foreword, is still a fractured history in part in this country, and there is very little that someone like me can do to right the wrongs that were committed, except perhaps to use the one skill that I have, and that is to write about it. So I have written about it, and I have written about several instances where people did things that they shouldn't have done and yet got away with it. And this fellow, who is the major protagonist in my book, decides that before he leaves the planet, needs to try to do something to avenge certain of these deeds. Now, this fellow, who is fictional, is a Vietnam veteran. He was a Navy pilot. He lost good friends in the war. He contracted, as did far too many, Agent Orange, and has, late in life, in his middle 60s, discovered that he is finally going to die of complications from this disease. So before he does, he decides to settle some old scores. Now, fortunately, after his Vietnam experience, he was lucky enough to get into business, and especially the technology and software business. My fictional guy made a pile of money, so at this point in his life, he's got every single resource he could possibly command or buy to pull off the episodes that he does within this book. I've connected these episodes together based upon stories that I have heard over the course of my life, talking with veterans, and, as I said before, based on some things that I heard about. And some of the stories are composites of characters that were real in the war. And again, as I mentioned, there are a couple of true stories within the pages. So that's how the book came together. My kids have been bugging me for years to write my story. And they apparently think that my life is much more interesting than I do, because I haven't done that, and I don't know if I ever will, because I think that there are far more interesting stories than mine. But I have become, as I like to tell people, a professional storyteller. So that's another reason for creating this book. And as sort of a compromise to my kids who kept bugging me about writing my story, instead of making up a name for this guy, I simply reversed my names. And in the book, the gentleman who is the main character is not Phil Keith, but Keith Phillips. So whenever you see that, it's kind of like, well. And some of what he does in the book is some of what I did, but I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to figure it out for yourselves, where the true guy ends and the fictional guy begins. The story takes place during these days, and really has chapters that erupt all over the world. And again, it's an effort on my part to perhaps help right some wrongs. And I sort of came to the conclusion that this book was necessary because I wrote two books, as Penny mentioned, about about Vietnam. The first one was Black Horse Riders. The second one was Fire-Based Illinois. And it was supposed to be a trilogy. There is a third book, but it has yet to be written. I spent a lot of time with a lot of guys who were the real heroes of those two books I just mentioned. I was thinking about it the other day, and I think that I probably contacted close to 500 veterans. I made contact with, meaningful contact with about 300 of those. 200 guys I really focused in on, and the stories of about 100 guys ended up in those two books. And it was a process that took between basically 2010 and 2013. And after those two books were concluded, frankly, I was so wrung out. I was so emotionally drained. I felt like I'd been through Vietnam all over again. And listening to the stories, and as Laura knows, guys calling me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they just had to talk. They hadn't talked about it for 40 years, but they wanted to talk about it now. So that third book is still out there, and I will get to it, but not today. So in the process of talking with all those men, and a few women, I heard these stories. I heard stories about others who had unnecessarily sacrificed their fellow soldiers. I obviously had heard the stories about Agent Orange exposure, and not to get too personal about it, but because of my Vietnam experience, the VA has classified me as 70% disabled because of Agent Orange. So I have the same challenges that the guy that I focus on in the book has. Only my editor's probably going to kill me first. Anyway, so I began to think about that, and I said, gee, wouldn't you like to be in the room with the guy that sold the Agent Orange crap to the U.S. government? And if you could be, what would you do? Well, there's a chapter on that. And that fellow does not end well. There was, I know this to be true, we, for example, during the Vietnam War, allied ourselves with an indigenous tribe of people in Vietnam called the Montagnards, who lived way up high in the central highlands, in the mountains that run down the spine of Vietnam. And they were fierce, ferocious, completely capable warriors, and they hated the Vietnamese. Centuries before, the Vietnamese had driven them from the shoreline communities and beachfront towns and villages where they had really come from, and drove them up into the mountains, and they had to sort of start over again. So they were ready, willing, and able to ally themselves with us to fight the North Vietnamese. Well, once the war started to wind down and U.S. troops started to pull back, they were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But then the CIA stepped in and took over the programs that the American military had been running. But then at the end of the day, the CIA basically abandoned them and left them to their fate, and it was not a pretty fate. So the fellow who was in charge of a chunk of that program, working for the CIA, has a chapter in this book, and trust me, he does not end well.
Phil, what company manufactured Agent Orange? Was it Monsanto or Dow?
It was Dow Chemical and DuPont
I
primarily,
thought it was Monsanto. It wasn't Monsanto?
and Monsanto, yeah, they were all,
Aren't there still ongoing cases involving that?
Yeah. Everybody knows what I mean about Agent Orange? Yeah. Okay. Well, everybody says Agent Orange, but there was also Agent Red, Agent Blue, Agent Green, Agent Purple. They were all highly toxic chemical compounds that were used primarily to defoliate the jungle. I mean, who thought it would be a good idea to try to defoliate the jungle? Well, so we sprayed literally millions of gallons of this stuff over certain parts of Vietnam in an effort to strip the trees of their foliage so that what? We could see the enemy who were supposedly hiding in the jungle. Well, there were tests. I mean, the military didn't do this blindly. They asked the chemical companies to provide evidence that this stuff would be safe. And they said, oh yeah, sure, no problem. It's all safe, don't worry about it. It turned out that those studies were falsified. And so literally hundreds of thousands of American servicemen were exposed to these chemicals in one way or another. And, you know, there are guys who handled the 50-gallon drums of this stuff practically in and up to their eyeballs, you know, getting it all over their bodies, covered with it, and they've had no problems. And there are guys who simply forgot to wash their hands once, who are stricken with one of the dozen endemic diseases that can result from exposure to this toxic combination of chemicals. There's even a group of veterans, they're called the Blue Water Navy. And it's a very large group, numbering in the thousands, of U.S. Navy veterans who never set foot on land in Vietnam, never spent one day in country. They have Agent Orange. How? Well, those toxins that were sprayed on the trees, when the monsoon rains came, washed down into the rivers washed down into the harbors, and in Da Nang Harbor, where the U.S. Navy parked God knows how many hundreds of their ships, these ships began to suck water out of the harbor to run their cooling systems and their saltwater desalinization systems, and were used by the sailors aboard ship to take showers. And the chemicals were in the water. Those guys are as impacted as I am. I mean, I haven't been in country. And yet they, to this day, have been denied benefits. You can't get benefits. But there's a big fight going on right now to secure them the same kinds of benefits that those of us who are impacted by Agent Orange do get. And I'm happy to say that one of our local politicians, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, is a big advocate behind the movement to get these guys benefits, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, it's not just us. I mean, there are 1.5 million Vietnamese who are impacted, not only them, but their children and now their grandchildren. Because guess what? The chemicals that reside in the bodies of those who are affected by it are passed on, can be passed on. Birth defects have been rampant among principally South Vietnamese soldiers who handled the toxins, and North Vietnamese soldiers upon whom it fell. And it goes on. Yes, ma'am.
What has happened to the land itself and the people who are presently living there?
The land,
Absorbed.
yeah, it's still a big problem. It doesn't wash out of the soil easily. It's there. and it lasts. They figure it'll last another 100 years.
Does the foliage come back?
Yes, yeah, the foliage does come back. I mean, that land over there, if you've been to Vietnam, you know this, that land over there is so rich in most parts, you could put a popsicle stick in the ground and it would sprout. You know, it's good soil, but it's very impacted.
Would the defoliation be a disadvantage also for you guys, because you could be spotted easier? Or are you looking from the air?
Well, it was primarily done so that we could bomb the hell out
I
of it.
see, yeah.
Especially, I don't know if some of you have watched the Ken Burns series on Vietnam. Well, you know the whole story of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and whatnot. You know, a lot of that was sprayed over the ground that comprised the Ho Chi Minh Trail so that we could expose the truck traffic and, you know, then go in and bomb it.
What year did it begin to defoliate? What year was it started?
I think that they first started using it, if I recall, in 1964.
Oh,
And they began to suspect that something wasn't quite right in 1967-68 timeframe, and they stopped using it, I think, in 69
was there any resistance by our troops
to
to being exposed to it? Or did we know?
No, but nobody knew. I mean, the troops who were handling this stuff were never told. And in truth, even the commanders who ordered it to be done didn't know. Those studies, those,
People in the, what happened to the people at Monsanto who sold it to the government? How much did they-
nothing, unless you read my book.
You made up something.
I made up something. Well, there was, after in the early 70s, I mean, you know, veterans started coming down with diseases, especially certain types of cancers and blood cancers, in numbers that were not consistent with the average in a population. So they saw these spikes of all these blood-borne diseases in particular. And somebody began to get suspicious. And the Veterans Administration did some studies and they went, holy shit, you know, we got a problem here. And that's when they stopped spraying it in the 69 timeframe, and then they began to dig in a little further. And of course, Monsanto and Dow and DuPont began to stonewall immediately because they could understand clearly what their liability was going to be with, you know, 2 million plus soldiers, airmen, sailors, Marines who had been exposed to this stuff in country. So the lawsuits began, and the principal lawsuit filed by the federal government against the chemical companies was adjudicated in the early 1980s, but it was very apparent to the chemical companies that they were going to lose, and they were going to lose big, and they were probably going to lose enough money to seriously impact the ability of these companies to continue to operate. So they tried to settle, and they worked out a settlement with the government whereby each claimant who would come forward as a veteran who could prove that he or she had been exposed and impacted by the Agent X chemicals would receive a payout with a maximum of about $8,000. $8,000. $8,000 doesn't begin to cover the pills I have to take on a monthly basis. So,
Who settled with them?
the government,
Our government?
yeah. However, once the chemical companies had resolved their liability, I mean, the sum total was in the hundreds of millions, but it should have been in the billions. The Veterans Administration decided that they weren't going to get too much more blood out of that stone, so they took it on. And I have to give the VA credit for doing this. I mean, and I'm sure we have some veterans. How many veterans? Okay, we have veterans in the room. I'm sure you've heard stories about the VA and VA medicine. Okay, I'm here to tell you I'm a living example of how well they can do. Okay, I've had the best treatment, and I am proud to say that they've done a tremendous job. I go to Northport. Anyway, the VA took it on, and they said, look, we got to fix this. And they have done a very credible job. Any veteran that comes forward that decides they should enter the protocol for testing to see if they've been impacted by this, once you receive that designation of service-connected disability due to Agent Orange, you've got medical care, whatever you need for the rest of your life. I want to tell you that. So that's a good thing, and it's costing the VA billions of dollars a year, and I'm sorry to tell you it's costing you billions of dollars a year in terms of your tax payments, but I hope you feel it's more of a payback than a burden. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Are we doing anything for the population that was exposed?
Are we doing anything for the Vietnamese? The answer is yes, finally. In fact, just in the last couple of years, has the State Department, of course it's a foreign government, so we have to work through the State Department. The State Department and the Veterans Affairs Department have formed a partnership to begin to address the needs and plight of the Vietnamese. And I mean, 5 years ago, we were doing nothing. Now we're putting millions and millions of dollars on an annual basis into at least care. I mean, unfortunately, we're too late into this game to have helped the Vietnamese generation that fought the war. I mean, you know, guys my age and so forth, but the majority of the help is going into the children and grandchildren, which is probably where, at this point, it should be applied. And it's one of the areas of cooperation between the government of Vietnam and the government of the United States that is a brighter star than it has been. I'm not going to inject any politics into this, but isn't it delightful that Donald Trump is finally going to Vietnam?
His bone spur got healed.
And his bone spur is finally healed enough to get in there. Anyway,
Isn't it too bad, though, that he couldn't go to the borderline because of the weather?
That was great.
yeah, the DMZ in Korea.
Yeah, all of a sudden the weather didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you a quick story, if I may. Speaking of going to the borderline, one of the delightful duties that I had when I was in the Navy is that after my third tour in Vietnam, my first tour I flew airplanes. My third tour was a ground tour, and one of my duties was to act as a flag secretary for Admiral John McCain. This is Senator McCain's father, who at the time was Commander-in-Chief Pacific and a 4-star admiral. I was his flag secretary for a year, which means I had to be sure that he was fully stocked at all times with the right whiskey and steaks.
Yes.
That was my job. And cigars. But anyway, I'll never forget this. One day we were flying on a tour to visit some troops out of MACV in Saigon, and all of a sudden the Admiral said to the helicopter pilot, we were flying a Huey, and he said, take me to the DMZ. Well, when a four-star admiral says, take me to the DMZ, I mean, I need to take him to DMZ, so we flew up. And he said, get me as close as you can. And the DMZ was that area between North and South Vietnam, which is kind of a no man's land. And supposedly, you know, it was a couple miles wide, and no action was to take place in this border area, but of course it did. So yeah, the pilot said, well, excuse me, Admiral, how close do you want to go? He said, put me on it, right there. So we landed like, 10 feet away from the DMZ, and the Admiral, I mean, I'm just practically peeing in my pants. I mean, he's my responsibility, all of his, I mean, if anybody on the other side saw what was going. So he jumps out of the helicopter and he slowly walks up to the barbed wire. I mean, you can't go any further. And he stood there looking across the DMZ for 15 minutes, didn't say a word. And he finally turned around and he got back in the helicopter and strapped in. He said, okay, let's go. And I said, Admiral, if you don't mind my asking, what was that all about? And he said something that still sticks with me today. He said, I was talking with my son. He was standing there at the DMZ staring across, knowing that his son was probably 40 miles away, living in the terror and the squalor of the Hanoi Hilton, being tortured. I was talking with my son. Powerful stuff.
Did he ever get his son back?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That's John McCain.
That's John McCain.
I thought there were two boys.
No, just the one.
One.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes, he did.
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Many people don't know this, but when Senator McCain came back from Vietnam, he had been shot down and taken prisoner as a lieutenant commander, and he spent so much time in captivity, got promoted to commander while he was a POW, and then shortly after he got back, he was promoted again to captain, which is, 4 stripes, and was put in charge of a air wing out in Arizona, which is his connection to Arizona, in case you didn't know that. And actually, a year later, he went up for flag selection for Rear Admiral, and he was chosen. So it would have been him, his father, and his grandfather who had all been U.S. Navy admirals. But he turned it down. And he turned it down because he knew that there was a seat coming up in Congress that he wanted to run for, and it was coming up right then. And if he wanted to go to Congress, he had to make a decision as to whether to accept the appointment to Admiral, which would require him to serve, or retire and go into Congress. So he elected, and here we are today. Pretty interesting, huh? So, boy, have I gotten off track. That's the story of settling up and why it's a book. Yes, sir.
There was a book in the library that I took out about a couple of years ago, and I can't find it now, but the story was written by a graduate student who was researching some of the atrocities that had occurred in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to an archive, I can't remember which one, I don't know if it was in the Library of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody at the library who heard what he was doing brought him a carton which contained reports of investigations done by the Army on atrocities committed by troops, and they had after they did the investigation, they didn't publish any reports, but they had them all, and they were all archived. And the book It's the only book that this graduate student published, as far as I know. But it details a number of things that happened. One of which that I remember describing was an officer who took his, had a helicopter and he would fly over fields, and when he saw people in the fields, he dropped hand grenades on it. And I think that what he was really describing were the sociopaths that found a home and an environment in which they could act out their psychosis in the guise of the war that was going on. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not familiar with that particular book or that archive that you mentioned. In case you couldn't hear, this is a question about war atrocities, and they were certainly committed by both sides. We're all familiar with the My Lai massacre. You've heard of that. There were other instances, not our finest hours, during the war, and there have been many studies written upon why this sort of thing happens, but this is not going to be a revelation to you, but war is a nasty business, and there were atrocities on both sides. One of the stories that I write about in this book is a story that happened to me and my best friend, who went through flight school together, and we were in the same air wing together, and on a mission south of Hanoi in 1971, he was struck. His aircraft was struck by a ground missile, and he and his intercept officer had to eject, and we saw the chutes. We saw them land in the jungle. No radio contact, but we knew they got out of the aircraft, and they, at least at that point, were okay. Well, the standard protocol was that if you were not successful in evading, it was pretty much impossible to do that. If you were captured by the local population or the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese forces, you were supposed to be, turned over to higher authority, and then all these guys, of course, ended up in POW camps. Well, Dave never made it, and we could never figure out why he didn't. And then later on, doing research for one of my books, I discovered that he had unfortunately landed right in the middle of a North Vietnamese regiment of soldiers, and the colonel of that regiment, a guy that I actually tracked down years after the war, took him prisoner, and instead of handing him over, he interrogated him brutally for information which apparently he resisted to the best of his ability, and pissed off the colonel enough that he took out his revolver and shot him in the forehead. So there's nothing I can do about the real colonel, but trust me, in the book he does not end well. So yes, there were atrocities on both sides. Were they widespread? I don't believe so. I really don't believe that it was a general problem, and we all know that because of the nature of the war, because we really spent a great deal of our time fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, that their frustration sometimes grew. And, villages were burned to the ground that didn't need to be burned, people were interrogated that really didn't need to be interrogated, you know. I don't want to be so blithe as to say, you know, this stuff happens, but it does.
We had those zones too called the free fire zones.
Right.
That anything that moved in those zones was fair game.
Right.
You didn't care if it was a farmer or whatever.
Yeah.
If they were in that area, they were shot at.
Yeah. And, you know, and in fairness to some of the troops, it was often very difficult to tell who the foe was. Especially the irregulars, the Viet Cong in particular. I mean, you didn't know if a guy in black pajamas was hiding a grenade in his back pocket or if he was just a simple rice farmer. And sometimes you didn't find out until it was too late. So there was that.
Did they enlist children in the Army? I don't mean women, I mean,
Children, well, yes, we did discover instances with kids as young as 12 having fought for the Viet Cong, again in particular, the irregulars. The North Vietnamese Army itself was a very professional army. They were very capable soldiers. They didn't have the depth and breadth of weapons that we had, but by and large they were well disciplined, totally different. When a North Vietnamese was recruited into the army, his enlistment in the North Vietnamese army was indefinite. He didn't know if they were going to be in the army a year or 10 years. And when they were recruited in threes. And 3 new recruits were paired with a veteran sergeant. And that sergeant stayed with them all the way through their training and took them out into the field. So they built their platoons and their companies and their regiments on these very cohesive, very well-trained units. And they fought very well. The youngest American casualty in Vietnam was 15. He was a young Marine from South Carolina.
he lied about his age.
He lied about his age and was sent to Vietnam and killed at the age of 15. The oldest combat casualty was 64. And if you look at some of the statistics, pretty interesting stuff. I remember doing some research for one of my other books, the ironies and the tragedies. There were 997 Americans who were killed on their first day of combat. There were 1,147 who were killed on their last day of duty before coming home. They were literally going to board the plane the next day.
Do you think that the Vietnamese learned from the Arabs about making the tunnels? I mean, were the countries really learning from each other about how to transport things underground?
Well, the tunnels, if you know, the question was about the tunnels in Vietnam. The most famous tunnels were the Chu Chi tunnels, which were used as an underground communications device more than anything else. The tunnels really were not effective for transporting large amounts of weapons, ammunition, material, food supplies. They were used primarily as communications tunnels to get information from one part of a region to another. And they weren't, you know, that extensive. I mean, they didn't go on for miles and miles and miles. Where they learned them from, I'm not familiar with that, but I do know that they were used primarily as communications tunnels. my God, the guys, the Americans who,
Tunnel rats.
tunnel rats, they call them, the guys that were responsible for going down into those tunnels and going after the enemy. Oh. Ooh, that's not the I would like to have. There's
How many
none of them.
pages is the book, and how long did it take you to write it?
Good question. 445 pages. How long did it take me? 6 months.
Yeah. Couple of months.
6 months.
Did you do as much research on this one as you, because this is fiction, obviously, so you had that liberty.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. And as I said a little bit ago, you know, fiction is not in my wheelhouse. I mean, my literary agent told me, he said, "You're a nonfiction writer, you can't write fiction." Well, when everybody tells me I can't do something, I'm the kind of person that says, "Oh yeah, watch me." Well, when I create a nonfiction book, it is process driven. People ask me, you know, how do you write? And, you know, what does it take to be a good writer? The best advice I ever got, and I stick to it, is that if you're going to be a writer, you have to write every day. Every day. And that's true. Because if you don't, guess what? You never end. It doesn't get finished. Now, some days, you know, you got a headache, you know, something didn't go right, you got a flat tire. Well, maybe you only write a paragraph. Next day, the sun's out, got a nice cup of coffee, sitting out on the deck or whatever. You write 3,000 words. It's great, but you have to stay in the moment or it doesn't get done. Nonfiction is like that for me. It's process driven. I do my own research. I don't hire anybody to do research, although I could. And I work at it every single day until that book is done. And obviously I'm chasing down facts and I'm starting at the beginning. I mean, you know where you're going to begin and you know where you're going to end. And all you got to do is chop up the steps in between and you're there, right? I love doing that. Fiction is entirely different. With this book, I knew where I wanted to start and I knew where I was going to end up. I had no idea what was going to happen between those covers. And for whatever reason, I have one of those kinds of minds. When I finished a chapter, the next one popped into my head. And I can't tell you why that happens. But I guess I'm lucky. But again, to me, it's a process. And when I decided to write this book, I finished a chapter, and the next one, boom, 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 and it just kept on going. Laura pointed it out to me the other day. I didn't even realize when I decided to become a full-time writer, it was 10 years ago this year. And I already had 2 careers. And in 10 years, I've written 10 books. And I didn't know. I guess I'm on a book a year track. And just so you know, the average book, you know, an editor, a publisher, you know, this is pretty average in terms of its contracts are generally written for 90 to 100,000 words in 330 to 350 pages. That's a standard book contract. So if you got 100,000 words in you, you can write a book. My good friend, some of you know, Nelson DeMille, he's written these monster books. You know, he used to write these 250,000 word books. And then he said, he told me last year, he said, "What a dummy. They pay me the same amount for 100,000 words. What am I doing?" So, any other questions I can answer? Yes,
Do you have
ma'am.
contact with any of your fellow officers from those years? Do you go back to I have a friend who's a former I'm not supposed to say former Marine, but.
Oh, don't ever say
No, I know,
that.
I just made that mistake.
No such thing as an ex-Marine.
No, exactly, I just remembered that. But he goes constantly to, every year to some reunion from San Diego to Florida to, and then my husband, who did 2 tours, helicopter crew chief, has no contact. It's an odd,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
go up together.
Yeah, yeah. You know, when I was interviewing guys for my Vietnam books, I mean, I ran across many of them that said, no, sir, not going back there. Mm-mm, that chapter's done. Have a nice day. You wouldn't even talk to me. And I understand that. I have maintained contact primarily with the guys that I went through when I went through college. You know, fortunately for me, I had a Navy scholarship. I was a NROTC student, and you know, there were 24 of us in my NROTC class at Harvard, and I have maintained contact with those guys more than I have with some of my squadron mates or guys that I serve. I mean, all 24 of us went into the Navy, and I think 2, 3 went into the Marines at the same time. And I maintain contact with a lot of those guys. In fact, one of them just came up to visit us a couple months ago. David Pell, we had lunch over again. But, so, you know, you do build up those kinds of relationships. Not so much with my old squadron mates, many of whom are scattered, but it's an individual choice. Yeah. Any other questions I can answer? If not, thank you very much. And the
So
book.
you brought a few books, right?
Well,
There's a book there.
I meant to bring books with me. I did a signing the other day. They wiped me out. I ordered more books, and they were supposed to arrive today. They have not arrived. If you'd like a book, I have a suggestion for you. Go to Amazon, and you can order the book on Amazon. You can order the book on Kindle or in print. If you do that, and if you send me an email, I'll give you my email address, I will make sure to send you a page you can stick in your book with my signature so you can get your book signed. How's that?
Very good.
Okay? So go buy the book at Amazon or on your Kindle if you do the electronic reading device, and I'll make sure it gets signed. I'm sorry. I have a couple of copies of my other recent book, Stay the Rising Sun, the World War II book, if you're interested in that. You can go to my author page on Amazon, which is pretty simple, you know, Phil Keith at Amazon, and see the other books. Buy them all.
Why don't you tell us your email address so we can write it
Okay,
down?
if you want to write it down, it's really hard, it's really tough. You ready? It's Phil dot Keith, Keith, at optonline.net. Phil.phil.keith, Keith, at optonline.net. I have a couple of cards if you want to see me afterward. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. We really enjoy having you here, and we're delighted also that you are in contract to write another book, and we'll read the book, and we're hoping we'll see a movie out of this thing.
Okay. Do you mind if I keep you one more minute to mention that book?
I also want to make an announcement after
Okay.
you.
No, you want to go
No,
first?
I want you to
Okay.
go first. yeah.
I'm really excited about this book. I'm doing it in partnership with Tom Clavin, as Penny, everybody knows Tom, right? Tom's another one of our great local authors, a good friend of mine. And we're writing this book about, it's called Love and Glory. It's about Eugene Ballard, who was the first African-American fighter pilot. His mother was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. His father was a former slave who was freed after the Civil War. Eugene was born in 1895. He ran away from home at the age of 12 from Columbus, Georgia, and found his way to France after an unbelievable series of adventures. 12 years old with $1.50 in his pocket. And he arrives in France after some adventures. At that point in his life, he's a semi-professional boxer. And his goal in going to France was to escape prejudice in the South. His father had told him that the French people were not prejudiced against blacks like we were. Turned out to be true. He lands in France, and 2 months later, guess what? World War I breaks out. So he decides to fight for his adopted country. He enlists in the French Foreign Legion. He fights in the trenches of World War I. He's badly wounded at Verdun. And when he's recuperating in the hospital, they tell him, I'm sorry, you're too badly wounded, you can't go back in the trenches. The only thing you can do is fly an airplane. So he signs up for aviation training, makes it through training, becomes a French fighter pilot, shoots down a couple of German airplanes. When the Americans get into it in 1917, he volunteers his services. He's turned down. Why? He's black. After the war, he settles in Paris, and hey, why not? I'm going to open a nightclub. He trains himself to become a jazz drummer. He hangs out with Hemingway, Picasso, Louis Armstrong, a whole, Bricktop, all the famous names of Paris in the jazz age, and lives through that. And in 1939, agrees to start spying for the French against the Nazis. And when the Germans take Paris, he goes back to one of his old French regiments to become a machine gunner at 44 years old, gets wounded again. The underground sneaks him out of France, through Spain and Portugal, back to America. He becomes an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center. One day he runs into Dave Garroway in the elevator. And Eugene is wearing one of the medals that he won in World War I, and Dave Garroway, the old host of the Today Show, remember him? Says, Gene, where did that come from? Tells him, he said, come on. 2 days later, he's on the Today Show. And I mean, it's just an amazing, amazing life, and nobody knows about it. Had you ever heard of him before?
No.
Well, there you go. You're going to hear about him now.